In this video, I'm going to be talking about low carbon aluminium and whether it's something that consumers can perhaps expect to be paying more for in the coming years. So the global green agenda has really accelerated over the last year or two. So you've seen growing policy commitments from China, the EU and the US towards that goal. The carbon emissions of the aluminium production represent about 2% of global emissions. And that's something that has come under increasing focus. Particularly the electricity cost of aluminium production is the main reason for that, because of the electrolysis stage of aluminium production, where you're converting alumina into aluminium metal. And you can see the role of more intensive, carbon-intensive power sources obviously has a big impact on the carbon emissions. I think the role of those more carbon-intensive power sources is something that's an issue, particularly in China. And they've shown particular effort this year to cut back on coal-fired powered primary aluminium smelting and try and build up this capacity or replacement capacity with power sources such as hydroelectric power. The challenges for the aluminium industry are really to do with the cost of this transition in terms of moving to more efficient power sources or making other carbon emission reductions to lower the threshold of carbon emissions. They all have a cost involved there, and it's something that as of yet consumers have been relatively reluctant to pay for specifically. In terms of premium differentials by major price supporters like Fast Markets and Harbour Intelligence and Platts, you've seen for primary aluminium metal that the willingness in that differential to pay more for the low carbon element has been pretty much flat, although the value added products have seen a bit more kind of willingness to pay that difference. The other issues with that are that the threshold, at what threshold do you define low carbon aluminium? What is the number you're going to pick to define what low carbon is, and what are your standards for calculation of that? Are you including everything that is within an individual company's control, or are you going back to their suppliers? So so-called scope 3 emissions, you're dealing with broader carbon emissions that are a result of that process. A lot of policy uncertainty as well, so governments can obviously step in, like China has done perhaps this year, by cracking down a little bit more on coal-fired power, or perhaps making generally electricity more expensive from high emission sources. Governments could also step in the other way and subsidise a low carbon aluminium. So that would be something where they're almost contributing to that transition financially. And then there are other costs potentially in terms of the trade of aluminium, so in terms of carbon border adjustments. And I think the relative balance of that government policy in terms of whether it's contributing via subsidies or equivalent to subsidies to this transition, or whether it's imposing a cost on higher carbon emitters, is something that has implications for aluminium pricing. I think as a conclusion, really, I think that net balance of government support is really going to define whether its producers have a cost that they have to pass on. But I think if we're going, I think the balance is that it is going to cost producers more, that cost is going to be passed on, and therefore the question becomes, how are consumers going to see that actual cost realised, increase in cost realised? And I think the answer is probably a balance of low carbon premiums if they're accepted, or perhaps it will be something that's taken within existing premiums for high preference brands. So it's something perhaps be a bit less transparent. I think if you have a mass move towards low carbon in the aluminium industry, it's something perhaps eventually is going to be reflected in exchange pricing as well, if it becomes widespread enough. So I think that overall there is a cost there that's going to be passed on, but the question of how that's going to be passed on is really subject to the government policy intervention, the impact of that, and the societal pressure around that to drive the change that's really desired.